class. It's Professor Streeter, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at the slideshow from week 1. Let me put myself in the bottom of the screen and return to this slide, which we did look at in class. A very basic thing we can say about myths is that they are stories, and that tells us something, but not a lot, because there are many types of stories that we don't call myths. So what more can we say about myth other than it's a kind of story? This is one of the goals of the course this semester, for you to come up with a working definition of myth yourself. After reading some of the stories together and thinking about the stories that you know from contemporary culture, for example, many of us go to the movies and watch the heroes of the Marvel universe on screen. Those stories are kinds of myths, you could say. How are they different from other types of stories that we read and that we tell ourselves, or that we are told when we are growing up? Okay, what can we say? Well, scholars have tried to define myths in many different ways. It's hard to define. I think you'll find it's hard to define anything, but myth is an especially elusive concept. Here's one example that I showed you in class, but let's look at it a little bit more carefully. This is a man named Lauri Honko. He's from Finland, and in the 1980s he wrote some papers about world mythology and folklore, and he tried to come up with a definition of myth. And here's what he writes. You can see the reference, the bibliographic reference there at the bottom. He wrote this in 1984 in an essay called The Problem of Defining Myth, from a book of essays edited by Alan Dundas, Sacred Narrative, Readings in the Theory of Myth. So here is Honko. He says, myth, a story of the gods, a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, the fundamental events, the exemplary deeds of the gods, as a result of which the world, nature, and culture were created together, with all parts thereof, and given their order, which still obtains. It's kind of a clunky sentence, actually, but it captures a common view about myth, and one that Lauri Honko is trying to condense into a definition, that myths are stories about the gods or divine figures, divine personalities. And this ties myth to religion. Now, that itself is a big assumption. Are all myths stories about gods or stories about divine personalities? Are all myths tied in some way to religion and to religious accounts of the origin of the world? Many myths are, but Honko is making a stronger claim that this is what defines myth. But certainly, myths are stories that talk about fundamental or significant events and go back to the origins of nature or of culture, right? So here, we're not just talking about the creation of the natural world, but the creation of the social world and culture. And myths are stories that try to explain or say something about the natural and social order that surrounds us and that still obtains, as Honko says. We look at the social world that we live in, or the natural world that we live in. A myth is a story that tries to explain in some way or show us something interesting about that order and how it came about. That's the first claim that he makes. Second sentence, a myth expresses and confirms society's religious values and norms. Again, for Honko, the kinds of values that myths express and confirm are religious values. That is an assumption that may not apply to many myths, what you might call secular myths, myths that don't have anything to do with religion or with God. But for Honko, myth describes stories that express religious values, religious norms. But like, think about the Marvel universe. These are not religious stories. They don't express religious values, but they do express social values and norms, and they provide a pattern of behavior to be imitated. Right? The hero myths in particular do this. They show us a kind of an example of a well-lived life or a pattern of behavior that comes to be imitated by the audience of the story. It also, he thinks, testifies to the efficacy of ritual. So here he ties myth to stories that relate to rituals, right? And they speak to the power of ritual. And the stories themselves are bound up in rituals. So they have a practical function. It's not just about telling a story, it's about telling a story that relates in some ways and is bound up in a ritual. And establishes the sanctity of cult. Again, for Hanko, myths are tied to the origin of religion and cult-like behavior, cult-like practices, cult-like rituals. And the myth gives those rituals and those group activities a kind of sanctity, right? Again, we can think about modern myths that maybe come apart from religion and come apart from the idea of a cult, but still, right? Myths are stories that bind people together in a certain kind of way. I think this is the thought, right? They are stories that are bound up in certain types of shared group behaviors. Okay, so look, we talked about the myth of Adapa, and you can think about it more. We can return to that in class, but think about whether that myth fits Hanko's definition or not. I want to turn here to the question of how to read these stories. Right? Again, this is part of the goal of the semester, to learn how to read an unfamiliar text, to learn how to read a story as a myth. What are we doing when we read a story as a myth? That is related to the question of what a myth is and how we define it, but in some ways you can't answer this question until you have a sense of what a myth is. But let's say we have a kind of working definition of what a myth is. How do we read it? Do we read it as a literal story? Going back to Adapa, it's hard to see what that would look like. We can read it as a metaphor or a symbol, and this is what Campbell thinks myths are, collections of metaphors. But that raises the question, then what kind of a metaphor? A metaphor for what? A symbol of what? Many have read myths as psychological metaphors or psychological symbols. So the events, the pattern of events, the series of events that take place in the story is symbolizing the psychological development of a human being. Or sort of sociological symbols, right? The story of the hero or the story of Adapa is telling, there's stages in the narrative, but really what we're being shown are stages of development in society, right? So the stages of the individual's life are symbols of the stages of development of a society. Right? So those are sort of sociological or psychological symbols or metaphors, right? We can read a myth that way, right? The story of Adapa is telling us something about psychological development, right? Or telling us something about social development, the development of social institutions. Allegory is another word here. We could talk about what an allegory is, but many have read myths as allegories. We can also look at the structure of a myth and connect the structure of a myth to the structure of other kinds of stories and the structure of nature, the structure of society, the structure of psychology, right? We can give sort of structuralist accounts of myths. Again, I don't want to say too much here, but this is something we can talk about. Like, what are we doing when we read a myth? How are we reading it? What are we supposed to make of it? Again, toward the end of class, I spoke about these 3 types of questions, and I hope these help you as you begin to read Gilgamesh. Where do you think this story came from? Why did it arise? Right? How did stories like Gilgamesh come into existence? That's one question we can try to think about and answer for ourselves as we read these stories. And then stories perform a kind of function for the audience, right? They fulfill a need. What is the need that the story of Gilgamesh might be fulfilling for its audience? And then lastly, what is the story about? Right? What happens? Like focusing on the plot uh, and the relationship between the characters. Right? What is the meaning of the story? What is it really about? Okay, so those are questions to think about as you begin reading Gilgamesh. I wanted you to write about myth in your discussion next week. You don't need to come up with a working definition yet, but you might share that in your posts, how you define myth. But I do want you to give an example of a story that has influenced you, a story that has shaped your identity or that speaks to you in some way. Right? How has that story influenced the way you look at the world, the way you live your life? That's one of the things I want you to write about in your discussion next week. Okay. Here's another way of forming the question. What are the defining myths or stories of your culture? What culture do you identify with? What community do you identify with? Are there defining myths or stories that shape your sense of who you are, you know, from the perspective of your culture? Okay. And here, right, when you think about those stories, you can ask origin type questions, right? Where do these stories come from? What need do they fulfill? And what are they about? Okay, so the last thought, and I didn't get to this in class, but we're looking at myths of origin in this class. Myths that show us something about the origin of a people, of a nation, of a culture, of a way of life. They're stories that shape identity. And we can talk about identity on many different levels. We can talk about cultural identity, political identity, right, or national identity. We can talk about ethnic identity, racial identity. We can also talk about gender identity. There are different ways of understanding our identity or talking about identity. But myths of origin are in some ways stories that are tied to those identities and that in some ways shape those identities. I think it's fair to say that we are experiencing as a nation a crisis of identity right now, or have been for some time. I'm pointing back to about a year ago during the riots at the Capitol, and right before Biden formally became president. So President-elect Biden asked this question after the riots in the Capitol last January. He said, "Who do we want to be as a nation?" It's a good question. It may seem hard to answer and too simple. I don't know. But I want to really think about that question as a challenge. We don't have to be one way rather than another. Who we are depends upon, in some ways, the stories that we tell about ourselves. And so, look, I mean, here's one picture of who we could become as a nation. This is a photograph of people who stormed the Capitol and tried to undermine the legitimacy of an election, of a fair election, or undermine the results of a fair election, and stood upon the Capitol, bashed in windows and doors, rummaged through the offices of elected officials, all in the name of, I don't know, well, all for the purpose of questioning a legitimate election, right? As a clear threat to the ideals of a democracy. That's who we could become, right? We could become, this is an image of what we could become as a nation. Here's another image of people on Martin Luther King Day, a day of service, right? Coming together to serve their community. I think this is taken in Philadelphia. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. We're about to remember this day in our nation's history.